Hello everyone, this is Discussion with Nico Gersamia. Today we have a very special guest, Mr. Kurt Volker, the former US Ambassador to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And first of all, Mr. Ambassador, I just want to express how grateful I am for you to be on the show today. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope we have a very interesting conversation today.
Okay, thank you very much. It's great to be with you.
Thank you. So let's begin with our first topic, so the war in Ukraine. So a few days ago, the President of the United States and his administration gave both sides 50 days to settle the war. And what we're hearing is that Russia will face severe consequences if there's no deal made within the first 50 days. The President has been very strict about it. He wants to see a deal made between both sides as soon as possible. He promised to end the war in 24 hours, and unfortunately that was not possible, and now he's trying everything he can. So my question to you, Mr. Ambassador, is what consequences could the United States bestow on Russia if a deal isn't made within 50 days?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for the question. As you said, President Trump put out a 50-day deadline, but this is really aimed at Russia. Ukraine has already accepted that they would agree to an immediate ceasefire in place if Russia did the same thing. So this is really aimed at Russia. There are several things that President Trump has done, and more that he can, in my view, should do in order to convince Russia to end the war. What he has already done, he has signed this minerals deal with Ukraine, so that there's a basis for the United States having an economic interest in Ukraine's success, and for Ukraine having the ability to pay for its own military support. So this is a way of taking the burden off of the American taxpayers and making it more of a fair business deal between the United States and Ukraine, which is much more politically sustainable. So that's the first thing. Second, he has approved the sale of American arms and ammunition to Ukraine, or to other countries buying on behalf of Ukraine. So that is something that Germany, for example, Norway, the Netherlands, they are all doing that right now to buy, for instance, Patriot air defense systems and provide them to Ukraine. So creating this pathway is also a way of showing Putin that he's not going to succeed in destroying Ukraine. There are other things that he has threatened, such as secondary sanctions. We already have sanctions on Russia for launching this war against Ukraine. Secondary sanctions would target countries that are helping Russia evade those sanctions, particularly, for example, China. So if someone were to engage in trade with Russia to help them avoid the initial sanctions, those countries' exports to the United States would be subject to a 100% tariff. And that's where this 50 days comes in. Trump has said that he will do that if there's not a deal within 50 days. One thing that the administration has not yet done, and I think they should also do, is authorize Ukraine to borrow money directly from the United States and pay us back later, provided that that money is used in the United States to buy American arms and ammunition so Ukraine can defend itself. This is another way of showing Putin that the supply line for Ukraine is reliable, sustainable, there's plenty there. Now, what is going to happen here? I think Putin is going to test this. He's going to take this 50 days out beyond 50 days and see what happens. I don't think he wants to end the war, and I don't think he's convinced that these kinds of pressure will really be applied. So he's going to test this, and we're going to have to actually follow through.
Yes, you mentioned secondary sanctions, which include China and a lot of BRICS countries who have been trying to evade the United States as much as possible. We saw what the first sanctions in 2022 did to the Russian economy. They're completely isolated from the rest of the world. And BRICS, this alliance to rival the G7, is trying to make it. They've been saying that they were going to make their own currency. However, that has not happened and probably will not happen and will never rival the US dollar due to its dominance. And I believe that Russia will also try to stretch this out for as long as they can, because Russia doesn't want to end this war. They would not have started it if they didn't want to end it. They want this to continue for as long as possible, because Putin faces the risk of him being overthrown. Russia's famous for its coups. And if, let's say, the war ends by Ukraine technically winning, meaning that Russia withdraws from all the territory, including Donbass and Crimea, Putin will likely be overthrown by his own military or people, or maybe a coup within his own cabinet. You mentioned NATO countries buying weapons for Ukraine. A few days ago, NATO agreed to buy US weapons for Ukraine. So let's move on to the alliance. What does this mean for the NATO alliance, that the alliance is buying weapons from America to give to Ukraine?
Yeah, well, this is very significant because during the Biden administration, aid to Ukraine was just that. It was assistance provided by the United States, paid for by taxpayers, no expectation of getting paid back. The Biden administration was slow on providing weapons. They put restrictions on the types of weapons that were given and on the use of those weapons. And they prevented NATO from having any role at all in supporting Ukraine. And President Trump has completely overturned that. He's created a means of providing arms and ammunition to Ukraine that's paid for, so it is politically sustainable for the long term in the United States. And he has now given NATO a role in coordinating that assistance and delivering that assistance. So NATO is now directly involved in supporting Ukraine in a way that they weren't during the Biden administration. This is very significant. And that opens the door to other types of NATO activity to support Ukraine. And what I would particularly urge NATO to do is to assist Ukraine in creating a strategically integrated air defense system. Right now, they have a mixture of different types of equipment from the United States, from France, from Germany, from the UK, some homegrown, some drone-based, and to actually create an integrated air defense system incorporating all of these, incorporating a single feed of intelligence. This is something that NATO should be able to help Ukraine to do more effectively. And so I think that would be a very important step for NATO going forward. And then finally, to create a comprehensive program for upgrading the Ukrainian armed forces. They are already in excellent shape, battle hardened, they're substantial in size, they're well trained, they're experienced. But nonetheless, NATO has experience with the integration and the structure of armed forces and the training of those forces, and particularly with a long-term focus on future development. That's something that NATO could help Ukraine with as well.
Yes, and NATO's role is really important in this conflict because NATO is primarily, while the biggest military in NATO and the leader of NATO is the United States, most NATO countries are in Europe, and the whole point of this alliance was to defend Europe from the Soviet Union. This is why it was created, and seeing NATO get more involved with Ukraine, I think it just creates a better situation for not only Europe but the entire world as well. It's a bad situation for Russia, which wants to completely destroy NATO, stop NATO expansion, and obviously it's not going their way. Finland has joined NATO, Sweden has joined NATO, and the alliance is stronger than ever, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Now,
well, what this is, it's a recognition that the security of Ukraine is essential to the security of Europe. This is something that was not apparent to leaders in Europe before 2022. But now they see that if Putin succeeds in his quest to take over Ukraine and restore the Russian Empire, that he will then turn his attention to countries that are already in NATO and that are already in the European Union, particularly Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland. So for the security of Europe, West Europeans, Germans, French, British, they now realize that making sure that Ukraine is safe is essential for their own security. This has been a very big change in the past couple of years, and I think it is why there is this degree of support for Ukraine, and I think it is why the Europeans will now make sure that Putin does not ever win in Ukraine.
absolutely, and this is really important because if Putin is somehow able to break the will of the Ukrainian people and win, the Baltic countries are obviously going to be next, and invading the Baltic countries means World War III, as we know that they are NATO countries, and it will be an absolute catastrophe. Now I'd like to move on to another major geopolitical conflict, specifically Israel versus Hamas, Iran, and Hezbollah. Yesterday, I believe, Israel was able to eliminate the commander of Hezbollah. And about a month ago, the United States took action against the Iranian regime by striking key nuclear facilities to stop Iran from obtaining a nuclear warhead. Now, we haven't seen any major change in Iran. Specifically, the regime is still holding onto power. While there are some instances of rebellion against the regime, they're still somehow in control. What would you say is the status quo of this current situation?
Well, this is a very interesting set of topics to bring up because it has only been 6 months since President Trump took office. And the changes that have taken place in the Middle East are really extraordinary. We've seen Israel basically decapitate Hezbollah so that Hezbollah is really not able to function as a fighting force the way it was previously. We've seen Iran's military capability seriously degraded, and including its ability to enrich uranium and produce nuclear weapons. That has been set back dramatically as well. Iran's support for Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis has also been damaged. Russia has proven that it is unable to help Iran, even though they might otherwise be inclined to try to do so. And Israel has really destroyed Hamas. To a point that is excessive now when you look at the humanitarian costs that are being borne by the Palestinian people in Gaza. But Hamas is no longer really able to provide much of a threat to Israel. So this is a fundamental transformation of relationships and security in the Middle East region. Now, you're absolutely right that this has not resulted in any kind of regime change inside Iran, and in my view, probably won't. There is a degree to which Iranians will rally around the flag, so to speak, to protect their country, since they have been attacked by Israel and then by one bombing run from the United States. So I don't think they're likely to try to overthrow the government in the near term. But it has substantially weakened the regime in Iran, weakened their capabilities, and I think over time, with discontentment that still does exist in Iran, it is going to put more pressure on the regime there.
Absolutely, and we saw what Iran did while they were being attacked. For 40 years, they've been saying that they were going to take down the United States. However, they couldn't do anything. They even made fake images of an F-35 shot down, and I saw on social media that the F-35 was bigger than skyscrapers, and it was absolutely hilarious when I saw that. Yes, and they are willing to fight around the flag, but I genuinely believe that there can be some kind of systematic change, maybe in the long term, for Iran, because this is a country that has amazing history and a really old country. And before the revolution, it was very different. And some people do want to go back there. However, I think this is more. It's not in the near future. I think this is a bit more long term. Staying with the Iran issue, the Georgian Dream government here in Georgia has passed almost every red line, including flying to funerals next to leaders of Hamas. And I believe when the United States struck Iran, they expressed the deputy foreign minister of Georgia expressed solidarity with Tehran, which sparked an absolute outrage in Tel Aviv. We're seeing an absolute shift in Georgia's foreign policy, where they're making anti-Western statements. They're making absurd claims about the West and the United States, including that they're saying that the deep state, or the so-called global war party, wants to drag Georgia into war with Russia, which is absolutely absurd. How far does the Georgian Dream government have to go for the United States to put its foot down and say, no, this will not continue?
Yeah, well, I'm not sure it works that way. As you know, I know Georgia quite well. I love Georgia. I've been there many, many times. I have family in Georgia, and we really want to see the country succeed and prosper and be part of Europe, be part of NATO. Georgia has, in my view, still a very bright future ahead. But unfortunately, as you say, the Georgian Dream government has taken many, many steps to distance Georgia from that future, from the EU membership to distance from NATO membership, to distance from a close relationship with the United States. So they really pulled Georgia away from that Western orientation. And the reality is that the United States or Europe, you can't make Georgia do what is in its own interest. If the Georgian Dream government is going to throw away those opportunities, there's nothing anyone can do about it. So the United States, the consequence for Georgia is that the United States is likely to ignore Georgia and just not be, how can we help if this is what the government of Georgia is doing? So it's going to be less attention and less engagement on Georgia rather than the U.S. putting its foot down and saying, okay, now you have to change. Simply not going to happen.
Yes, and that is very unfortunate. However, one thing I'd like to say is that the last election, which happened in October of last year, was not recognized by any Western country or almost anyone except Iran, Azerbaijan, and Russia maybe, and China. And what's happening now is that people have been protesting for over 250 days, I believe, at this point, ever since November of last year. People are fighting for what they believe in, believing that Georgia has a Euro-Atlantic future in the EU and NATO. And while people are fighting, we can't see that much hope because opposition leaders, including the third president, are in jail. There's many young people who are on fabricated charges sitting in prison. I'd like to talk about the Megobari Act. Do you think it's time to accelerate that in the U.S. Senate, as it would be a sign of major support for Georgia?
The Megobari Act was put together by Senators Shaheen and Risch, and then with counterparts in the House of Representatives. And there is broad support for that, and it would easily pass when it comes to a vote. But it hasn't yet come to a final implementation because it's not that important to people. What's important in the United States has been this big, beautiful bill on taxes, things about tariffs, immigration, defense spending. There's so many other things that are capturing attention that it's just not a priority for anyone to really press this. And back to your point about people protesting, I think that people need to engage in politics, engage in elections. Political parties that are in opposition to the government need to work together. If they are constantly fighting each other, they're just they're preventing any kind of electoral change. And I know that people are very concerned about whether any elections would be free and fair. But that's what politics is for, is you do your best to expose what's actually happening, make that a public issue, demonstrate what you would do better and differently than what your political opponents would do, and convince people to provide support. So there's no substitute for the Georgian people themselves doing what they need to do. People from outside, whether it's the United States or the European Union or Megobari Act or your parliament, no one's going to change Georgia other than the Georgian people.
Of course. However, Georgia's situation is very difficult right now. We have a Russian oligarch running the country, and he's basically backed by the FSB and the Kremlin. In countries like this, there's usually not a big chance of free and fair elections because if the opposition is winning, the government will come and just steal the votes. And this is exactly what people are protesting about. The OSCE has said that this election was not really free and fair, and Georgia's government has not been recognized.
Right.
And how else should the youth try to fight the anti-Western, pro-Kremlin government, because the opposition is very weakened because most opposition leaders have been sent to prison?
Yeah, well, you don't give up. You keep growing and you keep recruiting more people. You build political parties. You sharpen your messages. You reach people in the countryside. There's, I don't believe that the Georgian people want to be separated from Europe
Of course
or
not.
separated from NATO. I don't believe they're anti-Western. I don't believe that they want to be dominated by Russia again. So it's a matter of people, young people, opposition parties, engaging in politics, communicating with people, and creating that demand that Georgia move in a different direction.
Yes, and this demand is here. People are protesting, and I believe that it should be a matter of time. People are determined to give this country the future that it deserves with the West and not with Russia, and definitely not with Vladimir Putin. Now, I mentioned...
And on that, the West is ready to embrace Georgia, to help Georgia. It just can't do Georgia's job for it.
Now I'd like to talk about the third president of Georgia, which I mentioned before. President Saakashvili is currently imprisoned on fabricated charges, which include stuff like buying a Red Bull for Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State here. And he's serving, I believe, a 13-year prison sentence, and they're planning to add more sentences on top of that. He's the man who was warning about Russia in 2008. He was the one who led Georgia to survive in the 2008 war against Russia. This man introduced the world to Georgia. 3 U.S. presidents, including Bush, Biden, and Trump, have visited when he was president. While Biden and Trump were not presidents at the time, they did become presidents in the future. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice, during the war in Ukraine, stated that Saakashvili was right about warning the West about Russia, saying that after Georgia, Ukraine would be next, followed by the Baltic states. Do you think that there could be more action taken with President Saakashvili to do everything in your power to free him?
Yeah, I don't think that is the focal point of what the opposition and what the future of Georgia should be about. Saakashvili did a great job on a number of reforms in his early years as president. Then there were a number of excesses during his presidency as well. And I agree, it's unfortunate that he left the country. He did not contest the charges against him. He snuck back into the country, in a container. He's been arrested, and he went on this hunger strike. So a whole saga there, but that should not be what the future of Georgia is about. The future of Georgia should be about Georgia being a prosperous European democracy that is connected or part of the European Union, part of NATO, that offers something for its people. And this is something where all Georgians would share an interest. And to perpetuate this division of the country, Kotsinatsi, as two sides, that polarization is actually bad for Georgia. So I think the focus has got to be on the future and on political parties, leaders, opposition, protesters uniting around themes that are the best for the country.
Of course. I mentioned President Trump visiting Georgia. So here's what I'd like to talk about now. So President Trump, when he used to be in the real estate business, wanted to build his infamous Trump Tower here in Batumi, Georgia. He visited the country and said that he would build it. And before the project started in 2012, Ivanishvili and the Georgian Dream came into power. And here's what they did. They had the project canceled, labeling the current president an international fraudster. However, in the 2024 election campaign, they built their campaign around President Trump, saying that President Trump would end the global war party. President Trump would end the deep state, and that how the deep state is apparently fighting Georgian Dream. And they talked about this war party and the conspiracy that I will once again mention of getting Georgia involved in the war against Russia. If you were the advisor to the President of the United States, what advice would you give President Trump regarding the situation in Georgia? Because first this government is calling Trump an international fraudster, then he's a hero, and now that what they're saying is that he apparently lost his fight against the deep state.
Well, I would focus on Georgia's orientation toward China, orientation toward Iran, and orientation toward Russia. all of which are problematic for the United States. And I wouldn't get deep into Georgian domestic politics. The United States is not going to do that. But we do have American interests in ports, in doing business, in infrastructure, in access, in security, which, and including Iran, helping Iran versus preventing Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. China's Belt and Road Initiative, which is aimed at undermining Western economic performance. So there are just a number of things that are of concern that the Georgian government has opened the door to in Georgia. And that's what I would focus on. I would stay out of the domestic politics, but I would be very sharp on some of these international activities that are damaging to the United States.
Mr. Ambassador, during your career, you were the U.S. ambassador to NATO from 2008 to 2009. And this is a very important period for the alliance, as this was the year where Georgia and Ukraine were supposed to get the membership action plan. However, we remember at the Bucharest summit in 2008 that Georgia and Ukraine were not given the membership action plan in fears that it might provoke Russia, and Russia might be very upset with that. However, both of the countries were promised NATO membership in the near future. However, soon after that, the 2008 war with Russia happened, with Russia securing its control for over 20% of Georgia, including Abkhazia and the so-called South Ossetia region. Mr. Volker, if it was up to you, what would you do in this scenario? Would you make sure that Georgia and Ukraine would get the membership action plan, or would you try to appease Russia?
Do you mean now, or do you mean
in 2008?
Well, no, obviously back in 2008, we should have given Georgia and Ukraine participation in the membership action plan. This was the program that NATO had created to assist countries to become like NATO members, to prepare themselves. It's not membership. It's not a security guarantee. It is an assistance program, and that's what we should have done. Unfortunately, France and Germany wanted to block this. They thought it would be provocative to Russia. They didn't want to support it. So we ended up with this compromise at the Bucharest summit that was the worst of all worlds. It, on the one hand, promised membership someday, but then it created no means of how to get there. There was no membership action plan. And in fact, the decision actually said, Georgia and Ukraine will be members of NATO. The next step is the membership action plan, and we're not giving them membership action plan now as something to review for the future. So it turned the membership action plan into a way of blocking countries from getting closer to NATO rather than a way of helping them. So it was a huge mistake. And it was that lack of resolve, that clear communication of lack of resolve from NATO that convinced Putin it was safe to invade in August of 2008. So I think if we had done the right thing, he would not have invaded, or he may not have invaded Georgia in August of 2008. But because NATO demonstrated a lack of resolve, I think he felt that it was safe to do so.
Yes, absolutely. It felt that the alliance was really divided at that time, because the United States was strong and firm on its, and they were strong in their stance, saying that these countries should join NATO, they should be a part of this alliance. However, France and Germany said otherwise. So
remember, the United States was not advocating for NATO membership for Georgia and Ukraine in 2008. We were advocating for the membership action
plan, of course.
It's different.
Yes, of course it's different. However, they wanted us to get the membership action plan, and France and Germany vetoed it. And I believe, yes, you're absolutely correct in this case. It did show Putin that NATO is not fully united. Now might be a good time to maybe destabilize the Caucasus region. And that's what happened in 2008, I believe. And I believe if we were given the membership action plan in 2008, and same with Ukraine, it would have sent a different message to Moscow. It would have shown that NATO is united, it's not divided, and the war might have been prevented in 2008, in 2014 with Ukraine, and in 2022 with Ukraine again. And I believe that this was a huge mistake.
Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely. Now here's what I want to talk about, the situation in Europe with Ukraine at war, which is backed by the West, Moldova, who is struggling but firmly on the pro-European, pro-Western, pro-American stance under President Sandu, and Georgia, which is divided and currently experiencing severe democratic backsliding and a shift towards the Kremlin. These three countries once stood side by side under the Eastern Partnership, fighting for a future inside Europe. But in 2025, are these countries still moving together, or are they three separate stories heading towards three different directions? What would you say to this, Mr. Ambassador?
Yeah, but definitely three separate stories now. There are very, very different circumstances around all three countries. You said Ukraine is fighting a war. Ukraine's only fighting a war because Russia's attacking them. If Russia was not attacking Ukraine, there would be no war. So that's very important to say that the right way, that Ukraine is defending itself because Russia's attacking them. Otherwise, there would be no war. Then the European Union and NATO and the United States have all stepped in to try to help Ukraine in its defense against this aggression. And the European Union has recognized that Ukraine is vital to the future of Europe. So they have offered to accelerate Ukraine's membership in the European Union. They've been working very closely with the government in Ukraine to try to prepare the way for NATO membership as soon as possible. That's one story. In the case of Moldova, you have a current government in Moldova that is very committed to Europe and is trying to reform as quickly as possible in order to prepare itself to be part of the European Union. They're integrating with Europe's energy market as quickly as possible, and that will strengthen their relative independence. They've had a lot of dependency on Russia up to this point, and they're trying to break away from that. That being said, they're going to have an election this autumn, and it's possible that pro-Russian forces will win in that election. So the current government and its allies have a lot of work to do to demonstrate to the Moldovan people that they're on the right track. And then Georgia is the opposite, where you have a government in Georgia that is deliberately pulling the country away from NATO, the European Union, and the West in order to align with Russia and China. And so their prospects for EU membership now are basically off the table until Georgia decides that it wants to move back in the direction of moving toward Europe again.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Now to our final topic, the Caucasus region, the Zangezur corridor, and the we've heard lots of talks about this, about how important it is, since it's basically in the center of Europe and Asia. Mr. Ambassador, we've seen that the Russians tried to start up regional conflicts between Armenia and Azerbaijan, specifically to stop this corridor from happening. But now what we're seeing is that it's really much possible. And of course, the Anaklia deep sea port, which could be vital for the United States. Mr. Ambassador, why is the South Caucasus an important part to United States global politics?
Well, it is a strategically important area. If you just think about the map, you've got Russia in the north and Iran in the south, and you've got China in the east. And around this, you have countries that need to have access to trade routes. They need to have access to energy and digital infrastructure. They need to have access to Europe. And so you can run north-south, and you can have Russia and Iran blocking Central Asia and the Caucasus from access to Europe, or you can run east-west, and you can be connecting Central Asia and the Caucasus to Europe. And that is critically important. Russia has understood this for a long time. And so Russia tried to sustain conflict between Armenia and Azerbaijan. They kept relationships with both, but they also stimulated conflict. They created a never-ending negotiating process over Nagorno-Karabakh. and they maintained a troop presence inside Armenia. But as their war in Ukraine got worse and worse for Russia, they became more and more distracted and couldn't dedicate the resources to sustaining this frozen conflict in the Caucasus. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan and Turkey decided that it was time to kind of put an end to this. And Pashinyan in Armenia saw an opportunity for Armenia to break away from its dependency on Russia. So you now have a very different dynamic where Russia's role is seriously diminished in Armenia and Azerbaijan. Armenia and Azerbaijan are looking at a permanent and final peace. And the last remaining thing in getting a peace agreement to them is this corridor to connect the western part of Azerbaijan with the heart of Azerbaijan. And here I think it's very interesting that the US has come forward with a proposal to manage such a corridor so that it does not become a politically impossible issue for Armenia itself. This is potentially good for everybody in the region, and I hope that the parties find a way to go forward with this.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. And now our final question. What advice would you give to a 17-year-old who what advice would you give to a 17-year-old who wants to pursue politics as his career? What should they study? What should they do? And what should they pursue?
Well, I think the most important thing in politics is to communicate with voters. It is to understand what people care about, what they want, to try to help them understand the best way to solve problems. So many people in politics make it about themselves. They're saying, I want to be elected, I want to be in power, I'm better than the other people who are in power. And they're doing it on the basis of saying that they're better, rather than doing it on the basis of actually talking to voters and finding out what they want. So that's the number one thing in politics, is to not make it about yourself, make it about how you can serve others and serve them successfully and fairly. As for what to study, I think the most important thing in politics is rule of law and economic development. You need to be able to deliver for people. They want to live in a society that's fair, and they want to live with greater prosperity for themselves and their families. So economics and law are probably the two things that are most important as I see it.
Of course. Thank you so much for your answer, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you so much for being on this podcast. To summarize, I completely agree with almost everything you said. The Georgian people should fight for themselves, and they should not expect the West and the United States to do everything for them, obviously, and this is what's going on right now. We are fighting, and I hope we will meet and see our Euro-Atlantic future very soon. Thank you so much for being on the show today. It's been an absolute pleasure hosting you, and it's been an amazing discussion. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Good luck to you.
Thank you.